Hey guys, this is just a quick recap of how to build a spine rig using the Spline IK tool. Just to go over what we're going to make with this video, we're going to have a spine rig placed within a global move tool. Allows us to scale, position, and rotate our entire rig. Underneath that we'll have a center of gravity control, which will let us control our upper portion of our body as a whole, followed by the actual spine rig, which has three controls, one for the hip, one for the torso, and one for the chest. It will allow us to squash and stretch. We can rotate along the spine. We can rotate, like so. We have fine-tuning controls in the middle of our spine curve, so we can really get a lot of twist and bend, along with a hip control which does the same thing but in the opposite direction, so we can squash and stretch from the hip as well. And the great thing about this rig is that it allows us to have a lot of freedom of motion without having to worry about too much about counter animation and the likes of which. So let's get going. I've got a new file. I've quickly modeled up a chest or torso. The reason why I'm not using the shapes as in the other examples, because I'm going to show you how it looks with it skinned. I'll just quickly model this up. So before we get started, let's do a bit of housekeeping. If you're modeling your own models in the future, this is really important. So first things first, let's give this thing a name. Give it some geo, chest, or torso in this case. Let's go with torso. We're going to make sure our translations are frozen and all our history is deleted. Alright, cool. Now, for the most part, from now on, we're not going to really be using touching the geometry very much, so let's add it to a new layer. Create layer from selected with your torso selected, name it Geo, push save, and this will allow us to quickly reference our geometry so we don't click on it by accident as we're rigging our spine. Alright, let's get started. So with this in reference mode for now, let's go into our front view. So our front view here, let's turn on wireframe on shader, So we'll do that like so. I'm going to turn on ambient anti-aliasing to make it a little bit easier to see as well. So here's our geometry. We'll turn on X-ray joints to make things easier for us as well. Chuck over to rigging, the rigging tab. Select your rigging tab here as well, and let's start placing some joints. So we'll create our first joint around the hip, so we can put it here in the center, and you can snap it to the grid by holding down X. We'll scale that down a little bit, give it a 0.5, maybe even, let's reduce the radius actually to 0.2. That was a mistake, leave that as is. Alright. Now let's create a few more joints up the chain. So I'm just going to duplicate these ones for now. So let's duplicate it 5 times. 1, 2, by holding down Control D to duplicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to place them roughly at a point along our joint chain. So let's go there. Let's go put one here. Let's put one there. And here. I think that will do. In fact, it's probably a bit overkill, so I'm going to delete one. leave that there. No, actually, let's leave it like that. So we'll have a hip, we'll have 3 torso controls, and then we'll have a chest control. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, so we have a double there. And we'll chuck one up at the top here just to represent the base of our neck. Alright, before we move on any further, let's just make sure they're positioned in a way that feels about right. So we're going to get the most amount of movement out of our midsection of our torso. The chest will be relatively rigid from up here, because this is where the rib cage lies, and the rib cage is kind of fused to the spine. So if you're doing relatively realistic characters, you want to keep that rigidity. Whereas if you want to do cartoony characters, you can probably you can probably have the spine chain follow all the way up, like so. But we're going to keep it realistic to a degree. Okay, so let's quickly make sure it's relatively even along our mesh, like so. Let's start parenting him. So let's go with our neck is parented to our chest. Our chest is parented to our spine joint, and so on and so forth down the chain until our bottom spine is parented to our hips. Let's quickly rename our joints. So the first joint will be called deform, DEF, hips. Deform, deform spine 1. I'll copy that. Deform spine 2. Deform spine 3. I want to call the top one deform chest, and then we can call the top one deform neck 1. You don't have to have the neck there for this for building the spine rig. However, it's good to have it there just for now as a demonstration of where the rest of the joints will follow as you build out your body. Alright, cool. So that's that. Now the first thing we have to do after making the spine is make sure our joint orientations are consistent. So let's do that now. Oh, sorry, maxillary joints. Alright, so to make sure they're consistent, let's go to our let's go to our skeleton and orient joint with options opened. And with our entire spine selected along the chain, we'll turn on toggle local axes visibility. In our case, it's pretty consistent. We are planning on making it follow up the chain, the y-axis, because as we build out our spline, we're going to keep it aligned with the world. In this case, you can have it aligned with any axis, but just for the sake of simplicity, let's keep it aligned with the world. So just to make sure, select joint orient to world, push apply. Nothing happened, but in case your joints are all crazy like this with different rotations, reorienting the joints is as simple as pushing that button. Alright, cool. Let's get started onto our first step. Okay, so what is the first step? So the first step in our case is to skin our chest geometry to our joint chain. So let's unreference our geometry for now. Select our geometry. Select our joint chain, then our geometry, then push skin, bind skin options. We'll just go with a pretty simple setup. We'll just go with closest distance, weight blended. We'll just put the max influences at 3 or 4. drop off rate of 0.7. Oh, no, sorry, 7. Push apply. Now let's give it a quick test. Select our joints. Let's give it a whirl. So quick little rotations. Yep, we've got some nice deformation along the spine. Sideways. Yep, looking good enough. Alright, cool. This will allow us to test out our rig pretty quickly. So we'll re-reference our geo by pushing R on our little layers panel, and we can get started. Okay, the next thing we have to do is attach a spline IK from our hips to our chest. This will give us the first step towards creating that squash and stretch mechanism, as well as our rotations, and allow us to build our controls from that. So making the spline IK is quite simple. We just have to go to our skeleton, create IK spline handle. We'll open up the options box to make sure our settings are reset. Let's reset our settings. We're going to go with a number of spans of 1, and to make the IK appear, we'll click on our hips, then we will control select the chest. And as you can see, it creates 3 items: a curve, an IK handle, and an effector. Let's rename these first. So I'm going to call this one Spine Effector 1. I'm going to call this one Spine IK Handle 1 and Spine IK Curve 1. Cool. So what did we actually just create now at this point? What did we actually do to our spine joints with the Spline IK? Well, let's have a look. First things first, let's add these to a new layer in our channel box, where we'll create a new layer from selected. Let's call this one Joints. You will reference that. That will allow us to select our IK curve relatively easily. Let's just hide our IK handle as well. So this is the thing. This is what's really affecting our spine, the curve itself. If we go into Control Vertex and select, let's just hide our spine for now, shall we? Let's just hide that. If we select our spine IK curve, you'll see if we go into Control Vertex, we can manipulate our spine using this curve. Basically, the spine joints are constrained to this curve, which allows us to give us the range of motion we're looking for. So obviously, there's some limitations with this at the moment. We can't translate it side to side. We can't add any sort of rotations to it. We can only move it back and forth. But with a little bit of trickery, we can allow that to happen. So let's get onto that. Let's unhide everything first. Cool. So how do we add that more control? Well, we can't exactly manipulate our spline curve on directly, so we need a way of easily being able to manipulate that spline IK with some controls. And to do that, we have to skin our curve to 3 new joints that will be the basis for our controls. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll create a new joint in the same place as our original joint chain. Make sure it's centered. You can snap it to our original joints by holding down V. Let's create 2 more joints. We're going to place one at the hip. We're going to place another one at the center of our torso. So in my case, it's here. And then I'm going to place another one at the chest, here. we will rename these as deform, spline, okay, hips. I'll do the same for this one and call this one torso, and one more for the chest, and we'll call that chest. Now the goal is to skin this curve to these joints, and that can be done just like we skinned our torso. So let's select our joints, we will select our curve, we will go to skin, bind skin options, and use the settings of max influences of 3, joint hierarchy. We could probably change the drop-off rate a little bit. Let's go to 0.5, or 5.0, sorry. The reason why we're going with 3 max influences for this spine rig is because our spine IK curve has 3 points of 3 points in which we want to have influence. So let's go ahead and apply that. Now, if we select our joints and manipulate it, we can now, as you can see, move it back and forth, side to side, and so on. We still can't twist, but we're going to get to that in a moment. We have control in the center, and we also have control at the end. Nice. So, obviously as an animator, you don't really want to be able to control these joints directly, but we have a solution to that, and we're going to move on to that right now. Before we move forward, we're going to create 3 controls for this body. Okay, so when you do make controls for your rigs in Maya, we tend to use NURBS curves. In our case, we're just going to use some simple circles. So we'll create 3 circles. Oh, actually, let's just create 1 for now. Now, when it comes to creating animation controls, it's up to you how you want them to look. Sometimes it's best to give some sort of indication as to where the primary control is facing. You can do that by adding extra curves to this control, or you can actually just change the shape of the one that already exists. In this case, I'm just going to change the control so I know which way is pointing forward. I'll go to my control vertex, I'm going to bring this one forward, and then if I can do it, I'm going to bring these ones forward as well. So I can get a really tight sort of directional sort of look to it. There we go. I think that will do. That means it kind of knows that I kind of know that my hips will be rotating in a certain direction. It gives me a nice indication of how things are moving when I am animating. So I'm just going to go at object mode. I'm going to duplicate this twice. Let's call this control hips, control torso, control chest. Alright, cool. Now let's place him in the same place as our deformation joints for those 3 controls. So, by holding down V, we can drag and snap it to our corresponding joints. So control torso goes to deform torso, control hips goes to deform hips. Just make sure they're sitting pretty in the middle. Looks like they are. Nice. Alright, so let's quickly freeze those transforms. Alright, they're frozen. Actually, yeah, that looks good to me. Alright, now, before we move on, make sure you delete the history on these objects. So delete by type, history, sweet. Alright, now these are ready to become our controls. So how do we do that? That is done in a pretty simple manner. We are going to constrain our controls, or constrain our deformation joints to our controls using the parent constraint. So let's do that now. We will parent constrain our hip joint to our hip control. So parent, make sure maintain so offset is turned on. We'll push apply. Let's give that a go. See how now we can control with our hip controls. Nice. We'll do the same thing for our torso. Apply. And one for our chest. Apply. Now we have way more control, way easier control over our torso rig so far. So we have backwards and forwards motion, we have sideways motion, but we have no twist. Now is the time to add that twist. Now to do the twist, we have to use the spline IK handle. Notice how when we select the handle, it has a twist function here. Now there are some methods where we can use the twist function with a connection, with the connection editor, allowing us to simply connect the rotation of this spine to our twist. But unfortunately for that, you can only connect it to one item. We want to be able to twist from the top and the bottom, so that requires a bit more advanced inputs basically. So to do that, we're going to go to our attribute editor. We're going to go down to our IK solver attributes. We're going to go open up our advanced twist controls. We're going to enable it, and then we're going to change our world up type to object rotation up, start and end. We'll select that. Our forward axis is the direction in which our spine is traveling. So in our case, our forward axis is the Y. So I'm going to choose positive Y. Don't worry if it twists, that happens on purpose. We're not quite finished yet. Now, our spine itself is, our up axis is actually the Z axis. But in a weird way, in order for Maya to logically understand the direction of that, we need to give it its negative direction. So in our case, our up axis is negative Z. Now, it may look weird now, but don't worry, we're going to get to it in the end, get to the right position in the end. Alright, first thing we're going to do, we're going to change our up vector and our up vector 2 from being 1 in the Y and -1 in the Z and -1 in the Z there as well. That fixes up our alignment, and now we need to give Maya the right instructions as to which of our controls, which one of our joints will control the twist. So in our case, because we want to control our twist from our chest and our hips, our world up objects will be our chest joint and our hip joint. So let's feed in that information. First, just copy the name of our joints, spine, and then select back into our handle. So let's select our hip. Our world up drop. First one is our hips, and then let's select our chest, and then we're going to paste that in there. And now, if we're lucky, we should be able to get some nice twists. Nice. So if I show you with the wireframe. We're getting twist at the bottom, we're getting twist at the top. Nice even twist. So now we have to worry about our squash and stretch. So right now we can control it to a degree, but notice how the bones of our spline don't reach our controls. We're going to fix that by using the node editor to calculate the distance that the spline needs to stretch in order to reach these controls. Alright. Okay, so what is the node editor? So let's have a look. So if we go to Windows, General Editors, not General Editors, just go to Windows, Outliner, and underneath Outliner is the node editor. So let's open that up. So the node editor is basically a visual representation of our inputs and outputs. So if you look at our input for our spline IK for instance, we have inputs. That's basically clusters of information that allows Maya to calculate the different functionalities or the different outcomes of what we've done with our models or our rigs or anything like that. For instance, if we unclick our geo, we have inputs of a skin cluster, which is our skin mesh, and we have inputs of shape. So basically we have geometry information, and we have a tweak node. So if we go back to our Spline IK and open up our node editor, let's add that to our node map. So by holding down middle mouse button, we can click and drag it into our scene, or into our node editor, sorry. And look what it brings up. It brings up a few things. Sorry for that error, by the way. Hold on. So, sorry about that. Let's just open up our node editor again. Windows, node editor. So, as you can see, when we added our spline IK curve, it actually added a few things. It added a shape node, or two shape nodes in our case, and basically the invisible group node that contains the shapes. So, this is the one we're going to be working with, the Spline IK Curve Shape 1. These ones can be put aside for now. Don't delete these, don't push delete to hide them. It will actually delete the object from our outliner. That's not what we want. So if you want to hide these, you can actually hide them by going to View, or go to, let's have a look, Display. We can actually remove them from here. Remove selected nodes from graph. So let's just remove those for now. And just look at this one at its own. So in order to be able to have our spline stretch to our joint, we need to add some information to our spine in order to let Maya calculate the distance. So let's do that now. First things first, we need to see what our inputs and outputs are with this shape node. So to do that, let's click this button here. It has two arrows to indicate our inputs and outputs. So let's push this button. So as you can see, it's a bit confusing, but when you look at it in more depth, it becomes a little bit more understandable. So as you can see, we have our three control joints that are skinned to our curve. So basically, because we have this spline skinned to these three joints, it's feeding information to our Spline IK that allows it to be manipulated by these joints. These are just skin clusters related to our bind mesh, and this is our IK handle. So this is feeding information to our IK handle, which is related to our IK. So we'll leave that there. Now, what we need to do first is find out the length, the base length of our spline. To do this, we're going to add a new node. We're going to actually take some information from our node and add it to a second node. But to do that, push tab on your keyboard and type in curve info. So this is a curve info node. We can actually feed in information about our shape into this curve info node, which will give us information about our spline IK. So let's have a look at this curve info node. Let's just close this out the way. Let's get rid of that. If we open up our attribute editor, you can see there's some attributes that we can actually feed into this curve info node, particularly this arc length. So if we feed in information from this info node, from this spline curve node into our curve info node, it will give us our base length. So how do we do that? Well, we have to firstly expand our info node. We can do that by clicking these three little lines until we get to see this thing, the input curve. So we need to put in information from here into this input curve, and we're going to use the world space 0 node. So if we click on this little circle here next to world space 0, you'll get a little noodle attached to your mouse, and then you can click it into the input curve. Now notice how we now have a length value. Now your value will be different depending on the scale of your spine, of your model. So if your actual model is larger and your spine curve is fitting that joint chain, it'll be different for yours. So don't be worried if this is different. So now we can actually feed in some mathematics from this curve info and the spine curve shape into our original joint chain, allowing us to stretch both the spine curve and our joint chain to fit the movement of our controls. So basically we'll add in some mathematic formula that will allow us to fit our spine and our joint and our deformed joints to the distance of our control. So let's get into that now. First thing first, we're going to create a new node. Let's call it and look it up. We're going to look it up as multiply divide. We'll expand that. Alright. First thing we're going to do, we're going to feed in our arc length. So that number, basically we're going to feed in that information into the input of this node. So let's do that now. We're going to feed in the arc length from our curve info into spine, our multiply divide node. We're going to put it into our input 1x. Notice how in the attribute editor, if we have our multiply divide node selected, it puts in the same value from our arc length into our new node. First things first, let's just quickly rename this curve info node. We're going to call this spine curve info node. And leave that as is. Now, to get the length of our spine to stretch, we're going to change our operation to divide, and then we're going to match our input 2 to the original number on our input 1. So we're going to put 1.806. Now we need to feed in this simple little calculation into our spine joints. So to do that, we're going to select our original deformation joints. So we're going to go from hips, spine, spine 2, spine 3, and chest. We're going to drag these into our node editor. Whoops, I accidentally opened that up. And let's quickly expand everything. And we're going to just quickly drag these into a sort of cascade sort of look, just so we can see it a little bit clearer. Alright. Sometimes a node editor will sort of glitch and move things around, so if you don't want them to move around, we can highlight everything and push P on the keyboard, and that will pin our nodes in place. So we can still move them around, but it just stops them from automatically moving around if something else pops up. Okay, so if you look at our spine joint, we will be scaling along the y-axis, So because our joints are following upwards along the y-axis, so we need to scale along the y-axis. So to do that, we take out the output from this node, our multiply divide node, and plug it in to our scale y attribute of our joint nodes. So we'll just expand those. Whoops. Scale that. Now, to do that, we're going to use our output x because our calculation lies within our x dialog boxes. So output x into scale y. 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 Now we're going to ignore the chest because our chest is rigid, and that means we don't need to have the squash and stretch in our chest. That could be different depending on the kind of character you are rigging, but for our character, we're going to keep it rigid. So let's have a test. If we select our joints now, or our controls, and move it up, our spline is following along. That is exactly what we're looking for. And it works both ways. But we're still missing a few pieces of articulation. We are still missing some rotation along the x-axis, and we're missing some squash and stretch along the torso. So we're getting our stretch, but we aren't preserving the volume of our chest. So it's not squishing inwards as we stretch it outwards. Does that make sense? So we're going to do that now. We're going to fix up our volume preservation first, and then we're going to deal with the rotations of our hips and our chest. First things first, let's quickly do a little bit of housekeeping. Let's go back to our multiply divide node. Let's call this spine stretch underscore div for divide, just so we know what it does, what it's trying to do. And now let's continue on by adding our volume preservation. So we are going to create a new multiply divide node. Tap tab on your keyboard, type in multiply divide. Let's call this spine inverse scale underscore div. Actually, yeah, let's just call it that. You can also call it spine volume preservation div, if that makes more sense to you. So basically we're inversely scaling our x and our z attributes of our spine to maintain our volume preservation. So with that in mind, we're going to change our operation to divide. We will also make a second or a third multiply divide node. I'm just going to duplicate this one. I'm going to call this spine inverse scale power, so POW. and we're going to change our operation to power. So let's first work with our power node. We are going to now firstly take our spine stretch div output and put it in to the input 1x attribute of our spine inverse scale power node. So let's do that now. See how it adds a value. We're going to make our second input at 0.5. We're basically building a calculation for volume preservation. So if you look at your paper and look at the calculation, you'll understand what I'm doing. Okay, so with that, we have to link up our spine inverse scale power to our spine inverse scale divide node. So let's go ahead and do that now. And we're going to add an input from our, we're going to link our output x into the input 2x, not the input 1x, the input 2x of our spine inverse scale divide node. So basically we're creating 1 over the square root of a square root over 1x, if that makes sense. That's the basic calculation for volume preservation. Alright, with that, make sure it's set to divide. We're going to put our input 1 at 1 over the square root. 1 over the square root. Alright, so now we take the spine inverse scale div output x and plug it into our scale x and our scale z of our spine joints. So let's do that now. Output x into scale x, output x into scale z, output x into scale x, output x into scale z, output x, no, output x into scale x, output x into scale z, and continue down the chain until we reach our chest, which we are going to ignore. Now that's the calculation complete. Let's give it a go. Ooh, look at that. Nice. Notice how it kind of freaks out there. That's because our curve is trying to compensate, but it can't because our middle control isn't moving. It's causing it to cave in on itself. We're going to fix that as well, so don't worry. But we are getting that squash and stretch that we want, which is great. Alright, we are almost on our way. Okay, so because we got that little error, that little screw up there, let's fix that. So what we want to do, we want this control to follow in between these controls at an average distance. So we want this to kind of sit in the middle at all times. Now, we can't simply just point constrain these two controls to here because we will lose control of our middle joint. So our quick fix for that is to group this control onto itself and then constrain the group. So let's do that. We're going to click our middle control. We're going to push G, oh sorry, not G, Control G to group it onto its own. Let's call this control GRP torso. Now, we will point constrain these two controls to this group, not the control, just the group. This group practically acts as a parent to this torso joint control. So, with that in mind, let's select our chest, then our torso, go to constrain, point constrain, maintain offset is turned on, and push apply. and we repeat the process with our control hips to control group torso. Push apply. Now notice that the control group has its translates locked out, but our control itself does not. So we can still control things really easily. That's really nice. Notice how the middle control is following along, which is great. Alright. The thing about this control is that it will never be able to control the twist or the rotation very much. It's very minor and it's not really necessary. So, with that in mind, let's lock off our rotate and scales, because we're not going to be using those in this control. We're only going to be using it as a tweak control between these two joints, these two main controls. So let's select our rotate X, Y, and Z, and our scale X, Y, and Z, and lock and hide these controls. So we don't need to use them anymore. This means this prevents the animator from accidentally playing with those transforms. Okay, so now let's move on to fixing our little issue where we can't control our upper chest or lower hips with rotations. So that's a relatively simple fix. The reason why that's not working anymore is because our original joint chain is constrained to our spine IK curve. If we only had 2 joints, we'd be able to get away with rotations quite easily. But because we've got the 3rd joint here, also skinned to our spine curve, it's actually parented. It's actually having influence over the spline curve handles, basically. So it's preventing any rotation of the spline. But we can fix that easily by reskinning our body to these controls, these top 2 controls, and the middle joints of our spine. So let's do that now. We will go to select our torso, go to skin, unbind skin. Now select your chest and your hips, then select your spine 1, 2, and 3 joints. Then bind the skin, rebind the skin. We'll just go with the same settings as before and change the drop off rate to 7. Push apply. Oops. Select our. Make sure you select your the mesh as well. Push apply, and now we have much more control. I forgot, because this neck control is still parented to our joint chain. We need to reparent it to our Steph spine IK chest joint. So let's do that now. If we rotate now, we have our chest control. We have control over our hip rotation, and now we are good to go. I'm going to quickly rebind that again. So unbind skin just to make it a bit more obvious to you. Hips, we're going to select our spine 1, 2, and 3. I might also select I'm going to select our hips, our chest, and just in there I'm going to select our neck as well. And then I'll skin it, rebind. There we go. There we are. We've got some nice chest rotation there along the torso, the hip, nice, side to side. Never mind the skinning, that's pretty shit skinning, but you get the idea. But we have a lot of articulation, at least. Nice curve. See how the spine is curving nicely? Perfect. So all the functionality of our spine is done. What we need to do now is build a global control for our upper body, and then a global move control for the entire rig that will seat our rig inside of. Alright, so moving on, let's get to our center of gravity control. So we want to make a bit of a custom control for this one, something that tells us which way our upper body is facing when we manipulate that control. So let's go to create. We're going to go to curve tools, CV curve tool, options open. Let's change it from cubic to 1 linear and start drawing onto our grid. Hold down X to snap. We're going to go like, we're going to start here. We're going to give it a bit of an arrow sort of shape to it, just so we know which way it's facing. Alright, I'm going to move that forward a little bit. Control vertex. That will do, I think. Cool. Alright, let's move that in line with our hips by holding down V. Scale it to a comfortable size, like so. Let's freeze the transformations. Let's delete the history. And now let's rename this as Control COG. COG for Center of Gravity. Alright, cool. Now, what we need to do is basically group our spine rig first, and then parent constrain our spine rig group to our global control, our COG. So we're going to select our torso group, our hips, chest, spine, OK, torso, all the stuff involved with the spine control except for our geometry. Do not include the geometry. And we're going to Control G to group them. We're going to call this torso group. And then we are going to parent constrain our COG to our torso group. Constrain, we're going to turn on maintain offset, apply. Now we have full rotation. We have our translation and our scale. Notice how it's completely spazzing out, but also notice that it's being affected directly along the spine. Well, that's an easy fix, luckily for us. To fix it, we have to turn off the inherent transforms of our spline IK curve. We do that by going to our spline IK curve in the attribute editor and turning off inherent transforms. So turn that off. Now, if we translate and rotate, the spine is no longer freaking out. Alright, that's solved. Cool. Now, let's add a global control. So a global move control. Okay, to make the global move control, it's a little bit interesting. We're going to use a little bit of Melg script. It's not very complicated, don't worry. First thing we're going to do, we're going to select our torso group and our COG group, and then we're going to group them together inside a new group. We're going to call this group Control Global, CTRL Global. Now, notice how we can rotate and translate and rotate and all that sort of stuff from the center of our scene. But we don't have a control. Basically, we're going to create a control curve and then seat or parent that control curve shape into our group. So to do that, we'll make a new shape. So let's create a new CV curve. We'll select the CV curve tool, same settings as before, and we will give it some direction when we draw this up. I'm going to make a little arrow again. So I'm going to go like this. Let's see. One there, one there, one there, one there, one there. Go like this. And push confirm. I'm going to bring this forward a little bit. Now I'm going to select my control vertices and bring them forward. Do not select the shape, it will move the entire group forward. So let's just go like so. I think that'll do. Cool. So our global control is still centered in the center. We'll screen it down a little bit. And then we're going to freeze the transforms, and we're going to delete the history. Alright, cool. So how do we get this shape to become the shape of this control group? This group that has no properties, no fucking no shape to it. So let's go to display. We're going to enable shapes. So what this does, it basically opens up the shape groups, if that makes any sense. Because when you open up the node now, see how it has a curve shape? The shape itself has another node inside it called a curve shape. We have to take this curve shape and parent it or move it into the place of our control global control. So to do that, we expand our curve, select our curve shape, and then control select our global group, and type in at the bottom, I'm going to close these, down here in the bottom, type in parent -r -s, and then push enter. Notice how the curve shape has shifted into our control global node. Our curve group is now empty. We can delete that. And now if we go to shapes and turn that off, notice how our control global group has now a squiggly line to indicate that it has a shape node connected to it. So now we can use that to translate and rotate everything. But we have one more issue to go, and that is the scale. The scale, when we use our global control, is still spazzing out. And that's down to our control curve yet again. We can't fix it by disabling inherit scale, because we already tried that with our center of gravity. So that's already being affected that way. Oh, that's weird. And luckily for this rig, we aren't going to be using our COG, our center of gravity for scale. These will be locked off along with the rest of these controls. However, we still want to be able to manipulate the scale of our global move control, because this is what will be setting what will allow us to set our rig in certain scenes. So sometimes we might want to have our rig at a higher scale. Whereas with our global control, our COG, we want to make sure at least our rotations are consistent. but we're going to lock off our scale in a minute. But we still need to fix the scale issues with our global control. So to do that, we have to go back into our node editor. So let's go ahead and do that now. No, sorry. Let's open up our node editor. Windows, node editor. Now notice how a few things have kind of come up and popped up in our node system. So let's just rejigger that so we can see things a little bit more clearly. Notice how the ones that we have pinned haven't moved, but the ones we didn't pin did move. So let's just remap this by clicking this button here, layout the graph. It will help us reorient things, and there we go. Now, what we need to do is create another multiply divide node. So let's open up tab, multiply divide. Multiply divide node. We're going to call this global scale spline normalize underscore div. Now we're going to get this curve info node and punch in the arc length of that node into our input 1x. So let's grab the arc length, chuck it into our input 1x. So the spline curve info, the very first info node we added, into input 1x. Now we're going to grab some information about our global control. So where is it? It's not in there. So we're going to grab in our control global node, middle mouse button, drag it in. Where did it pop up? Probably popped up in the middle of nowhere. Where are you? Here we are. Down here. Grab this guy. Expand it. Control global. We're going to put in our scale Y into our input 2x. Like so. We're going to set the operation of this spline normalized div node to divide, and then we are going to replace a connection in our node hierarchy. So let's move some stuff out the way. We're going to feed in this new calculation into our spline normalized div. So we're going to replace this connection from our spline curve info with this global spline normalized div. Our output x will replace our original arc length calculation. So output x into input 1x. Now let's give that a go. Save the file. Let's try scaling from our global node. Nice and clean. We have perfect rotation and we have perfect translation. Now that's our rig. That's our spline rig done. The only thing now we have to do is put in some housekeeping. So because we don't want the animator to be able to scale and break our rig, it's going to break it, we are going to lock off and hide our scale attributes for our COG. We're going to lock and hide. We're going to lock and hide the scale of our spline controls. lock and hide selected. This one we already did that to these. We will also lock and hide the scale of our joints here, because they can still be manipulated. So lock and hide. Okay, and here we are. We have our rig completed. We have movement. Never mind the skinning. The skinning is horrible. We have rotation along the upper chest. We have rotation at the hips. Never mind the skinning yet again. We have translation. We have manipulation along the middle of the spine. Perfect. So that's our spine rig. We can also lock and hide any attributes of our IK handle as well, just to keep it clean, but for now let's just leave it as is. Alright, that's it. Good luck making the spine. I hope it isn't as arduous as it seems. If you follow these steps, you should be able to get a pretty clean result. Alright, thank you.